Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book. And I have a really funny story about this book before I even really introduce it. You may have watched my conversation last week with Allie from Heart and Soul Connected. And Allie has a book club. If you're interested, you should check that out. I would love to do it. I just don't have time at this point. I can barely keep up with my own self-imposed schedule. So, having said that, Allie and I are pretty good pals, and we were chatting, after we made our video, and she is always trying to find a book that we can talk about together, and we're both tortured with our schedules. So anyway, she says, I have a really good book, and we're doing it in my book club, and I wonder if you've ever read it. And she holds up this book. And I said, well, wait a second, because as a matter of fact, the book I have scheduled to do for my Saturday book this week is this book. So Allie is doing this in her book club, The Land of the Gods, and I prepared this months ago on the suggestion of one of our subscribers here who wondered if I'd ever heard of this woman. And this is The Land of the Gods, The Long Hidden Story of Visiting the Masters of Wisdom in Shambhala by H.P. Blavatsky. Now, yes, I had heard of her. And the only thing I knew about her was, and take this with a block of salt, the jury's still out, but I knew nothing about her other than she was some sort of charlatan, paranormal person. That's all I knew. So I decided yesterday that I should probably read a little bit about her personal life. The book is not her personal life. The book is ostensibly based on experiences that she had. I say ostensibly because, like I said, the jury is out about this woman, but she's a very interesting person. And many interesting things about her, not the least of which is her first name, Helen. So, she starts out on a positive note. Madame Blavatsky, or her real name, Helena Hahn von Rottenstern, was born in Russia, in a place that's now part of the Ukraine. At least it probably is. Not who knows now what's going on. August 12th, 1831. And so the first thing I was surprised about was how much longer ago it was than I thought. I thought she was sort of running around with all the medium people in the 1920s, but no, she was before that. In 1875, she helped to co-found the Theosophical Society. I had a teacher who was a theosophist. Somehow I can't say it today. She was a theosophist. She was a retired chemist who taught at my girls' school. A very, very interesting person. 16 years old, got her PhD, a genius, and was a concert violinist at the same time. It seems so unfair, doesn't it? Anyway, already distracting myself. Madame Blavatsky. So it's hard to know facts about her. Everything I've read about her comes out and says, look, we don't really know what's true and what's not true. She intentionally provided contradictory and false information about her origins and her life, and her family contradicted themselves too. So it's very difficult to know. She was born, as I said, in 1831 in Russia. Her father was away. She was born into a family of aristocrats. Almost immediately after the moment of her birth, she and her mother both got cholera. There was a cholera epidemic, and they both survived. Her mother was the daughter of a princess, and I don't really know entirely what that means in that time and place, but aristocrats. Her father was descended from German aristocrats, the Hans, and he was in the Russian Royal Horse Artillery. And when she was born, he was away suppressing the November uprising and didn't actually meet her till she was 6 months old. Her great-great-grandfather was a French Huguenot, a refugee to Russia from France, an aristocrat who fled the religious, stuff. Her family moved around the empire with her father's career, and I think this is an important consideration in her later life, her adult life. You'll find that she was nomadic. She was what I would call peripatetic, and I almost wonder if it was a symptom. We'll talk about that a little more later. But her father got stationed at a variety of different places, and as a result, as a child, she was exposed to very interesting cultures that middle-class white people really knew nothing about. Middle-class Christian Europeans, let's say, knew nothing about. When she was 2, they were in some God-forsaken place in the middle of nowhere that had no medical help anywhere, and her younger brother died, and her mother had had enough of that. So her mother moved her to Odessa to live with her mother's family, her mother's grandfather, her maternal grandfather, Helena Blavatsky's maternal grandfather. Her mother's father's family lived in Odessa. And this is where her sister Vera was born. Eventually, after moving around with her father's profession for a while, they landed in St. Petersburg. Her mother really liked St. Petersburg and put down roots there. And her mother became a writer, a translator of things that were in other languages to make them available for the Russian market. When the family moved to a place called Astrakhan, which is, I don't know, I get the impression it's Central Asia, like in the Caucasus maybe, Blavatsky learned Tibetan Buddhism. And now she's still a child, basically, and was really into this. So that's interesting. She had an English governess. She learned to speak English. She also spoke Russian. Probably also spoke French, would be my guess. Then her mother died, just very tragically. Her mother died at the age of 28 from tuberculosis. And Helena was sent to live with her maternal grandparents. They were no longer living in Odessa now. They were living in some other place in Central Asia because of her grandfather's job. He had to move around a lot. So this whole family was very... They didn't put down roots much. She was described as a spoiled, sickly storyteller of a child. But she was exposed to esoteric ideas because she discovered the library that had belonged to her great-grandfather, and he was into all sorts of esoterica. He was into studying the Freemasons and Eastern religions. And so she read a lot about this stuff, and she began to have visions. So there's a lot of very odd stories about her. And I take them all with a block of salt, because there's no way to know for sure. When we get to her actual writings, it's interesting, but her life is really odd. So she started having visions of an Indian man, a man from India, and claimed later that she met him, and we'll hear about that. She claimed she could astral travel. She had all kinds of paranormal experiences. When she was 17, she married Blavatsky. She had cold feet at the very last minute, but they forced her to marry him. He was in his 40s. He worked for the government, but she liked him because he believed in magic, and, which is a solid foundation for a marriage, I gotta say. Anyway, she tried to back out, and it was too late. Once the marriage ceremony was over, she tried repeatedly to escape, and eventually he just said, fine, go back to your family. So rather than go back to her family, she ended up traveling apparently alone, because it said nobody from her family was with her for 9 years. And the question posed, because this is all uncertain, was where did she get the money? From her rejected husband? From her father? Nobody knows. For the next 25 years, there's no reliable information about her. She was in, when you hear this restlessness, you have to wonder. She was in Constantinople, Egypt, Paris, England. She met the Indian that she had visions about, who was a Hindu man that she called Master Moria. She went to Tibet via Canada. She spent some time in Quebec with Native First Nations people in Quebec. Went to New Orleans, did a little probably voodoo down in New Orleans, then went to Mexico, went to the Andes, went to the West Indies, Ceylon, and then Bombay. And she stayed in India for 2 years. The British, of course, were the Raj. They wouldn't let her into Tibet. They didn't trust her, which I think is an interesting sort of a sub plot in her life. Excuse me, I'm getting hiccups. Eventually, in 1854, England was hostile towards her because of the English and Russian battle going on in where Crimea. What's old is new again, right? Crimea. From there, she went to New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, Japan, India, Burma, and finally she claimed she went to Tibet in 1856, and from there to Java, France, Germany, and back to Russia. All along the way, she studied esoteric topics, met people involved in all sorts of different spiritual practices. She claimed a number of psychic abilities. She ended up getting back with her husband. They adopted a child, and the child died at the age of 5. In 1864, she fell off a horse and was in a coma for several months. She had a spinal fracture, and when she woke from the coma, she claimed all sorts of paranormal abilities. Bilocation, levitation, dematerialization, telekinesis, telepathic abilities, et cetera. And just keep in mind, there are no reliable witnesses. There's no reliable documentation. Because people make these sorts of claims is not a reason to doubt them just out of whole cloth, but we don't know. We just don't know. She went to Italy, then she went to Transylvania, then she went to Serbia. When she was in Italy for a while, she studied the Kabbalah with a rabbi. She claimed that she was injured in Italy while she was fighting for Garibaldi. Now, this is where I start to go, wait a minute. I suppose if you're a volunteer in a revolutionary kind of battle, they'll take anybody. But a woman who has a head injury, and I don't know. I just don't know. Anyway, she heard, excuse me, from the Indian man, Mariah, went back to Tibet, claims that she went with him into Tibet and studied Tibetan Buddhism. She claims she learned an unknown language and translated ancient texts and further developed her psychic powers. Now, Tibet was closed to Europeans, and so there's a lot of doubt about what she says. However, they did let Asians in, people from Southeast Asia, Central, they let them in. And she was in the presence of Moriah, this Indian guy. Could she have disguised herself and gone with him? Yes, she could have. That's true. She did exhibit, it has been remarked upon, that she exhibited an advanced understanding of Mahayana Buddhism, which would have been really odd, unique for her time period. For a white woman, yeah. She believed that her mission in life was to spread spiritualism, and she cast doubt on spiritualism the way it was practiced at the time. She had a lot of mediums who had seances, and this is in the mid-1800s, 1860s, 1870s, that they were channeling elemental spirits. They weren't really doing what they claimed they were doing. She was one of 16 survivors. This is just, what a life, you know. She was in a ship going to Egypt when there was an explosion on the ship and only 16 people survived. She was one in 1871. She began the Spiritualism Society. She traveled, and this is traveled again, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria. She studied with the Druze. Then she went to New York City and joined a women's housing cooperative and did piecework sewing. When her father died, she inherited a significant fortune and moved into a lavish hotel and started, living the high life. She committed bigamy. She was still married to her husband back in, Ukraine or wherever he was at the time. And she married a guy in New York City. He was sort of obsessed with her, but they fell out and he divorced her, and that was the end of that. Now, there's a lot of information available about her, and I'm glossing over quite a bit because it's very complicated. Her relationships, the people she encountered, the things she learned, the publications she did, her personal relationships, and the evolution of the Theosophical Society are complicated, full of all sorts of complex contrary relationships and animosity and accusations, and I just cherry picked the most important things. So she met a guy called Henry Olcott, a reporter, and he was able to publicize her quite a bit and draw attention to her. They formed together, the two of them, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and lived together in New York City, which, that was kind of interesting for the time period. Their apartment is described as being full of taxidermy and spiritual images. Can't imagine. Then they formed the Miracle Club, where they would get together and do lectures on esoterica, and this eventually evolved into the Theosophical Society. Theosophy is a made-up word, means the wisdom of God or divine wisdom. They never were able to agree on the definition of theosophy. It was this mishmash, and I'm not being disparaging, but I don't know how else to describe it, amalgam of all sorts of esoteric, especially Eastern belief systems, and they came and went. They changed. It was fluid. It was called a wide umbrella, is how it's described. I'm sure it's settled into something now because theosophists are still around, and I didn't look into what they believe today because we need to get on with the book. But I wanted to establish a little bit of background for Blavatsky. She wrote a book called Isis Unveiled in 1875. She claimed she didn't write it, that the lodger who is in me wrote it. That's a quote, the lodger who is in me. So she's talking about channeling, automatic writing, I guess. It's full of ancient wisdom. It was a huge commercial success. So she moved to India, and the British didn't like her. They thought she was a Russian spy. I think this is so interesting. They never trusted her. They didn't like her moving around freely. They kind of kept their eyes on her. Who knows, right? It doesn't seem like she had a lot of loyalty to Russia. She didn't seem very attached to it, but you just don't know. There's not reliable information. So they evolved this theosophy, this group, and this conglomeration of ideas, beliefs, philosophical beliefs. They're the ones who came up with the term Mahatma, meaning master. She manifested paranormal activities at her home for guests. I guess you could say like a seance, but not really. It was a display of her abilities. She and what's his name? Oswald? No. Alcott. In one ear, out the other. She and Alcott were the first Americans to convert to Buddhism in Ceylon. She wrote the Mahatma letters, which she claimed were communications from the masters. And it was a book that was 1,400 pages. And Buddhist scholars say it's not Buddhism, but it's ancient stuff, but it's not Buddhism. They established branches of theosophy across India, and they claimed that partially their intention was to combat the spread of the missionary fervor of Christians that were going all over India. She had Bright's disease, which I believe is like an endocrine disorder, and ended up back in France, then traveled to England. I mean, she's sick and she's still traveling. There was a big scandal in India about the money having to do with the Theosophical Society, because there always a money scandal. And I didn't even go into it. I started to read about it and I couldn't keep track of who was who and who did what, and he said, she said. And I decided, okay, the important factor here is there was a money scandal which damaged the reputation of the society, but she wasn't even there. She was in England being sick. So she lived in Europe. She moved to Belgium for a while, and then she settled down in London. She continued her activities for the Theosophical Society and her paranormal stuff. She got Gandhi and Yeats, both were involved with the group. She founded a magazine named Lucifer. I thought that was interesting. And printed other things and was controversial from beginning to end. And eventually she died of the flu on the 8th of May in 1891, which is celebrated every year remembered every year by the Theosophical Society as White Lotus Day. So let's talk about this book. Now, she has written all sorts of books, both fiction and autobiographical and then philosophical. So this is more of a fictional version of what she claims she actually went through. So it's fiction based on part of her life. And it's about her trip to Tibet. So let's dig into it. And I'll warn you, it's been several months since I've read this, so I may take me a while to refamiliarize myself. The Land of the Gods by Helena Blavatsky, written in 1887. She did not write it under her own name. When it was published anonymously, written by a student of occultism. And it was claimed that a guy called Franz Hartmann wrote it, but she wrote it. In 1910, it was republished under the title With the Adepts, and it says it was handed to me by a friend, a writer of considerable repute. So there's not even 100% certainty, who wrote this thing. The claim is she wrote the notes because only she could get access to the Holy of Holies on earth, Shambhala, the secret abode of the Masters of Wisdom in Tibet. So in 1939, so quite a bit after this came out, a woman named Helena Roerich continued Blavatsky's work and confirmed that Blavatsky had given the notes to this book to Franz Hartmann, who collated them. Shambhala is defined as a stronghold in the Himalayas with a network in various other mountains and remote locations globally. So it's this loose affiliation with the central, like a monastery in the Himalayas in Tibet. Blavatsky's notes from the Himalayan Alps are all tied to one story, the secret order of the Rosicrucians. So you can see already this is getting complicated. The part one, the beauty of the mountains. This is all told in the first person, and she claims it's almost like a diary. And she says that she's writing in the southern Bavarian Alps, and she took a holiday in the Alps near Austria because she needed a break from researching the Rosicrucians. And she describes being outside in this fresh, clear air, the crisp, snowy mountain air. And it's snowing, on the ground, snow. And she climbed to a small village inn that she describes, and I wrote in parentheses, this reminds me of Heidi, the book Heidi. and she did write, there are pieces of poetry inside the book about the mountains, and I skipped that. So in the next morning, early in the morning, she climbed the mountain and she was following a stream, and she felt drawn to a valley that she had never explored before. And this valley was said to be inaccessible, and no foot had trod before upon it, is the story. She had to pass through dense, dark forests and emerged out of the trees and saw inaccessible cliffs. But she heard a waterfall somewhere nearby, and she describes the rising sun on the highest peaks. This is very much like Heidi when you read the descriptions. And most of the valley still in the shadows and the changing colors of the snow. It was an idyllic scene. The mountains were named after people that they resembled. And she said that these mountains were shaped by weather and time. And she discusses in great detail the varieties of wildflowers. And the wind is so powerful that high up that the trees don't stand long enough to get really tall, that they're dwarf trees. And, she's talking about moving into different ecosystems as you increase in elevation, basically. So she rested in a pine grove by a waterfall and was mesmerized and went into a meditative state. And is wondering at the human impulse to the human impulse that seems to exist across cultures and times and people, the desire to set consciousness free, out of body, to want to leave the physical body and mix with the universal life. So if our consciousness is a function of our body, okay, or is it? Is it a function of the universal consciousness that's using the body? Now, what's really important, I think, to remember about this book, I had to keep reminding myself of this. This book was written quite a long time ago. It's not ancient. It's not basically new ideas about life and existence and the meaning of life and the nature of consciousness. It's all stuff that's been talked about before and is still being talked about. What's unique about it is the context, that this is being explored by essentially a white European woman in that time period. That's unusual. And to put this out in the public, the audience would have been wholly Christian, wholly WH, Christian Europeans. This is where it was published, or Christian Americans. It would, at least, people not of an Eastern tradition, and many people never exposed to any of the ideas in the book. So just keep reminding yourself, okay, well, this doesn't sound like any great revelation. Well, it was to the audience who read it. The people who originally read the original publication were like, whoa, what is this all about? So she wonders at the notion, is it possible that our consciousness wants to separate from our body and mix with universal life? And is our consciousness a function of our body, or is it part of the universe? And is it connected temporarily to our body as a tool? And there's a higher immortal spiritual aspect to it? Or does the spirit die with the body? Does consciousness die with the body? So this is the ultimate question, right? So if our body is just a vehicle for the spirit, then it's not our true self. And if so, where does our consciousness go when we die? And is that why we can commune with nature? That there's something inherently inside of us that's able to reach out and join with the energy of nature? Does part of our consciousness remain with the body when we daydream and travel in our mind? I think that's a great question. In fact, that's a question we could easily ask the cards if I could find a pen. You always have 15 pens till you need one. Okay. Is there really any such thing as dead matter in the universe? What she's asking is, do rocks have a soul or consciousness. And you know what Dolores Cannon said in her books. So, and you know what the plasma physicist said. Yes, it's all about vibration, and they may be vibrating very slowly at a very low frequency, but they are. So even stones are held together, she says, and they're held to the earth by energy forces. Now remember the time period. And their particles and energy is spirit, in her opinion. Therefore, all things possess life or souls, and therefore there must be spirit beings that don't have physical form. That's kind of a logical inference. She felt that that where she was in this pretty place, a cleanness of perception, a deeper concentration of thought, a higher conception of truth, of the relationship between nature and humans. So she's communing with nature. She's getting back to nature and communing with Gaia and making that connection. So she says, away from the superficiality and the shallowness of society, the tomfoolery of society, as she puts it, and the great urbane asylum that she calls the world the great urbane asylum. I love that. Solitude, she said, is the best condition to grasp ideas. And ideas once formed and shaped can be given material expression through thought and are thrown upon the great mirror, the astral light, to be used by others. Now, there's a concept that wouldn't be common in Middle European or Middle American society. Can human mental activity exist independently of its form? And if so, what causes it? And while sitting and thinking, these light thoughts as you do, a man, a dwarf, shows up and invites her to his master's house. And she asks him, well, who's your master? And he says, the imperator. Wait, what did I write? Imperator. I'm sorry, I can't read my handwriting, but we'll soon find out. And so she followed him. And she said he was a little person, but he was dressed like a Capuchin monk. They wore Capuchin little brown hats, and they wore a hooded long robe with a hood that could come over. So, part 2, meeting the Lord of Shambhala. So she followed this guy along a path near the stream and came to a huge wall, and it had an opening like a tunnel, like a cave, and they went through it into a beautiful valley of super terrestrial beauty, surrounded by mountains like a natural amphitheater with air and light that seemed ethereal. It seemed like a valley of peace on a tall mountain above this valley. In the tunnel of the wall, opening to a valley, and in the distance a mountain, and on the mountain a massive stone building. It had high walls and a dome, many windows, turrets, balconies, lots of clouds around it, around the mountaintops and the building. Now this looks quite Asian. But she's in the Alps, so I don't get the impression that what she saw was necessarily Asian like that. But it is taken from her experiences in Tibet. So there's a little bit of mixed cultural references, I think. She saw a broad avenue leading through the valley to the building. A man was approaching in a yellow robe, and he was her guide. And she prostrated herself in front of him. And the little man disappeared. This man in the yellow was about 35, tall, commanding. He looked, she said, full of spiritual energy. He seemed to read her mind, and she thought to herself, surely he must be an adept. And the guy said, now she's thinking this, and the guy says, yes, you have fallen into the hands of the adepts you often wish to meet. I will take you to our temple and acquaint you with our brothers of the Golden and Rosy Cross. So this seemed familiar to her, And she realized this guy it is Imperator, the Imperator of the Rosicrucian Society. And this is what is said to her. You're right, we're not strangers, for I have often been in your presence and stood by your side, although you haven't seen me. I've directed the flow of ideas which streamed into your brain while you elaborated on them and put them down in writing. Moreover, you have often visited this place while your physical body was sleeping. That's another thing that Canon talks about, your soul doing all sorts of stuff while you're asleep. And you have conversed with the brothers and me. Still, when your soul returned to its house of flesh and blood, it could not impress the memory of the brain with the recollection of the events through which you have passed, and you could remember none of your transcendental experiences when you awoke. The memory of the material form retains only the impressions made upon it by the avenues of the external senses. The memory of the spirit awakens when we are in the spiritual state. Now, this is all earth-shattering concepts to conventional middle-class Christians. She says this is the happiest day of her life. She's told you will have enough time to stay and see how we live. You can't stay forever. You have duties. And she herself, her energy was too full of too many lower and animal elements. Her vibe wasn't high enough. She wasn't spiritual enough yet. She was told if you stayed, you would waste away like having consumption, tuberculosis, ironically enough, and you would die. She asks about transmutating base metal to gold, because of course she did. And the answer is, it's only a mystery to those who cannot see the truth, which is the universal will. It's a mechanical force on 7 different planes of existence, and it's a spiritual force. And if you are capable of doing that, and we learned about those different levels and planes in the Hermetic philosophy, and she's told the will is the law. So let's see what else he said. The will is the law, the universal power holding together the worlds in space and causing the revolution of planets. It pervades and penetrates everything and doesn't require you strengthening it, for it is already strong enough to accomplish everything possible. You are only an instrument through which this universal power may act and manifest, and you may experience the fullest extent of its strength if you don't attempt to oppose it. And then he tells her not to think she has her own will, which he's not talking about free will. He's talking about something else, intention. Your will is strong only if you remain in all things obedient to the law. You can't not succeed by pushing your own will. You must use reason and intellect to guide the will of nature, and therefore to accomplish what would otherwise take much longer, acting in accordance with the law of nature. Nature obeys those who act in obedience with her laws. The highest intelligence to which we can aspire is an understanding of the universe. So he made clouds leave, and they looked alive. And she says, life in the universal and the everywhere is identical to the will. Nature lends it to humans, and when we exit, we must return it back to nature. Some of this stuff is sort of, arcane. It's a little hard to understand. I'm going to read that again because it's difficult to understand. Life is universal, and everywhere it is identical to the will that nature lends it. Humans get this will from nature, and when we exit, we must return it to nature. The only advanced soul is the one who has fixed some of the life principle in its inner self, and can then therefore retain it after death. The building that they were in had marble steps and 2 stories, but very, very, very tall stories. There was a gold inscription on the door that say, "You who enter here, leave all evil thoughts behind." The vestibule had a big Buddha, golden, and there were inscriptions on the walls from the wise sayings of sages. And there were long corridors going off of it to the apartments of the different brothers. So it's like a monastery, kind of. The opposite area from the entryway had a door to a beautiful garden, and at the rear of it, a large white marble domed building. On the top of the dome was a silver dragon on a golden globe, and she was told this was the sanctuary of the temple and that she could not be admitted to it or she would die. And inside, it's all dark to those who don't bring spiritual life. So this is sort of a common theme in many religious belief systems. For example, the temples in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and other pagan temples, there were areas where only the most holy were allowed to go. In the Jewish religion, the Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum, was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and only the highest priests were allowed to even go in there. There was something about spiritual evolution and development, and perhaps even bloodline, that allowed you to enter into the darkest, most advanced areas of these religious buildings. The walls of the corridor had beautiful paintings of monasteries, and if you focused on them, I think this is interesting given the time period, if you focused on them, it became like the way they described it. I wrote it in my words, but the way she described it at great length, it was like a live feed. You could watch these places. It was like there was a camera set up somewhere, and these were actually screens where you could watch what was going on, and these were all their monasteries all over the place. And there were religious symbols everywhere of all different religions. So she went on to say that the name Rosicrucian, which comes from Rosy Cross, is not Christian originally, and it's like all occult societies. There are adepts, people who are advanced in the knowledge. It was adopted by Johann Andral, who invented a night called the Christian Rosicrux to make fun of adepts from other religions. The rose and the cross were used by religions for thousands of years before Christianity. So a lot of this stuff the symbolism has kind of been lost in time to most of us, and it was ancient snark, ancient insult, and they would have gotten it. They would have immediately understood it, but it's lost to us because it's been so long. Most Christians wouldn't even understand it, is what she says, and it has a lot of deeper meanings, esoteric meanings from the past. And she said most Christians only worship external forms, and beliefs, creeds, dogmas, and opinions are imaginary knowledge. They're not real. Well, she's told that what we know and store in our memory is not real knowledge. That people can't be told the real knowledge. We must grasp it with our hearts intuitively. That it's not something that can be expressed in words, and all of the preachifying in the world doesn't get the point across, is what she's trying to say. You have to feel it and understand it. This is something that I'm going to paraphrase this and put it into a more modern frame of reference, that you have to feel it in your DNA, and you have to be ready to even get it. And it's like Dolores Cannon has been told 1,000 times in all of her books, our brains are just not up to it. Therefore, our language is inadequate. So this is something that is a vibration that you have to feel. And what is this something? The truth. of existence. Belief without knowledge, she's told, is superstition. And his words, now I don't even remember what was so weird about this that I put in big gigantic letters. These are his words, not mine. I apologize for constantly qualifying everything I do in these videos, but I get dinged. I get in trouble if I don't make it really clear that I'm simply passing along something I've read. I'm not pushing any belief, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm saying this is what this particular guy in a fictional book said. Theology is not real. That knowledge is always in danger of being overthrown by the next new thing, that truth can't be overthrown. And it's understood spiritually, it's felt, and it cannot be disrupted. So he's making a distinction here between the external constructs of institutionalized belief systems and what's really true. So Rosicrucian order has no doctrines and no creeds and no beliefs. It's not about that. He said if we were in a state of perfection, we would not be here. We would be in nirvana. So nobody is perfect. If you're a human, you're working on something. He says that the monastery, the monks still study, but they use reason. We don't venerate our sources. We use them. And they have a library with thousands of books, which would have been relatively unusual. Private people had libraries, but there weren't a lot of available public libraries. So many ancient books are in this library. They've been heard of, but not previously seen. And she says that she's shocked to be able to see these books in real life. Many are about priceless Hermetic philosophy, and they have these books saved, not because they just want to keep them, but because they have left an impression in the astral plane. And therefore they're here because they exist in the astral plane, a universal storehouse. It's the memory of nature, and the question is this the Akashic Records? I think that's what they're talking about. Their founders of this monastery were able to create the illusion of this place and a library to keep all this stuff safe. But it's an impassable barrier. You have to be the right vibration to even be allowed in. They live in peace. They know of the outside world. They know of it clairvoyantly, not physically. They use astral bodies to go check things out. And this lets them give their thoughts to public leaders and inventors and to pass on knowledge for the advancement of humankind. It's very interesting. So she says, well, why not exert influence to end political violence then, if you're so powerful and if you're so tough? if you have these abilities, why don't you use them to stop wars? And he says, I hope you're all trying to guess why, because you're right. There's a certain law of justice which we need to observe because its action is expedient for the evolution of the race, although people may perceive as evil those consequences which they caused. As the surgeon sometimes has to inflict pain to remove a cancerous growth and save the patient's life, it's often necessary to purge the organism of a nation to restore its health. Wow, is that ever applicable today? It's said that evils are blessings in disguise, and God may execute his purpose through the instruments available at his disposal. In other words, lessons learned are often very difficult. And most importantly, they cannot act against the laws of free will. Each person must create his or her own karma, and they can give advice, but they cannot interfere with freedom. Now, who does this sound like? Sounds very much like Whitley Strieber's E.T. friends, right? She asks, why not save the innocent? And the answer is they'll have their reward, and to suffer for others brings the greatest rewards. She wants to go inside, but you can't. You have to be an adept, and you have to grow into that. It's not overnight. Many people consider a life like this, but they have to be evolved enough to actually live that life, and to live in peace with other people. You need to nurture harmony within yourself first. Great progress would be made in theosophical monasteries without all the rubbish of misconception and superstition, she's told. So this guy is kind of dissing her organization. I think that's very interesting. Or Blavatsky is sending a message to the members of the Theosophical Society who are at each other's throats, which was happening at the time. She goes, right now there are two types of life, a religious life or a science life. And a source based on science is based on logic and observation. Observation depends on the fallibility of our senses. So it's an external illusions. Now, he's talking about science, and I want to make it really clear. These are his philosophizing comments about science. I'm not a proponent. I'm not saying this is true or false. I'm just reiterating what he says, that science doesn't really know anything about spiritual life, and doctrines about fundamental laws of nature are on a plane like the Hermetic philosophers talked about, different planes, that what we think we understand is really on a plane that's not full understanding. We can't see the internal, the invisible, the causes, and the causes we see are actually the result of what we can't see. So what we're really seeing are symptoms and results of something unseen and ununderstood. We know nothing about the tree of life from which all transient phenomena spring. All theology is based on misconceptions of terms intended to signify spiritual powers. You have to think about this, put it on hold for a while here and just sort of digest that. Priests, etc., are not spiritual. They don't have the ability to conceive of these things. They're operating on a completely different, far more superficial plane. And okay, this is his words. I'm not saying whether I believe it or not. They're narrow-minded, priests, narrow-minded. They dispute each other. They narrow down universal principles to personal, limited things. They reduce God to an extra cosmic deity who can be persuaded by by mortals. He could be persuaded by mortals to change his will, and who needs earthly deputies to execute his divine law. So we know where he stands. Your religions are of a dead, impotent God who left an army of clergy to rule in his stead. Modern religion is, they are systems of superstition from which truth has been excluded. Now, this was real. I mean, it's even difficult for me to say because I don't want to insult people who are religious. There's nothing wrong with being religious. We each have our own spiritual path. Well, he's talking about the structure of the institution, the hierarchy and the rules and regulations and how they manipulate people with do's and don'ts and try to bring down great spiritual knowledge and concepts like the creator, the source of all life, and bring it down into the supposedly digestible image of an old man with a beard sitting in a throne. That's what he's talking about, that they have insulted these larger great spiritual beliefs by trying to make them human. And that's not possible. That what has happened is that religions have put fallible mortal priests in the place of the Creator. And as a result, love has departed, that fear rules. And I think all we have to do is look at fundamentalism today. And it doesn't matter what brand fundamentalism. Right now, Hindu fundamentalists in India are persecuting Muslims in India. There's just all sorts of prejudice in every hierarchical institution. Individuals seek their own happiness with these schools of thought, and they ignore other people, like those homeless people or those hungry people or whatever. Each one wants to be saved at the expense of another. Each one wants to obtain a reward they have not merited. All think that to live is the object of life, and few realize the fact that life can have only one reasonable object, namely to benefit humanity, and can only hope to live eternally by obtaining the power to live, not in their perishable self, but in the spiritual element of humanity. Trying too hard to save their own skins is what he's saying. So we may see, but we don't feel. The human brain is an instrument, and it needs to be made more able. It needs to be more superior than what it is to be able to manifest the highest principles in the universe, the principle of divine wisdom. And this instrument is the soul. So I'm going to stop here because this is the end of that section, and it's a good place to stop the video. We'll start up with part 3 in the next video. So I hope you're not offended. I hope you understand the distinctions that this adept, this monk, is making between truth and spirituality versus human institutions. That's the important distinction. I think it's fascinating that this was discussed by a European woman in the mid-1800s. Who would have thought? Okay, I'll be back momentarily, and in the meantime, slung with foil.